So still, I would request once again, guys, please change your name on Zoom. You can simply go to more and then rename your name. That's it. That's the request. And now we are on live also, Manoj, on YouTube.
Great.
Okay, great. So Manoj, let's wait for 2 more minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, and then we will start.
Sure, no problem.
Thanks. And guys, one more thing that so it will be around 40 to 50 minutes, okay, of the session. And after the session that where maybe we can pick some really good questions on GraphQL. So I would request to all the attendees that, okay, please, whatever the question that you have, please ask the question with respect to the topic only, that is GraphQL and its testing, or if you have any suggestions or any kind of questions with respect to GraphQL, please feel free to ask. Other than that, I think it's really difficult to entertain all the different questions. So please don't ask questions other than GraphQL. And people who are actually joining through live on YouTube, those live chat videos also, I mean, questions also, we won't be able to entertain as of now, because otherwise it'll be too much. So Manoj will be definitely will be happy to answer most of the questions after the session. And during the session, please, I would request to all of you that please be on mute, turn off your webcam, and then I think it will be a great session for us. So I think let's wait 2 more minutes, and then I think then we will start. Okay, I think now we have good participants. We can still, the count is still increasing. Right now we have 170 participants and more than 100 people are watching on YouTube. So let me quickly introduce myself. That this is guys Naveen here from Naveen Automation Labs. You must be knowing about me through my channel. And then we have a very special guest today, Manoj Kumar, who is the main contributor. You must have seen his name on different blogs, on different commits history in Selenium and APM. He's a main contributor and main committer for APM and Selenium, especially for open source community. Manoj currently is working as a principal automation engineer in ThoughtWorks in Bangalore. And we recently had a conversation that, okay, let's start some really interesting stuff so that we can communicate and we can educate RQA community with different new cool topics. So thanks, Manoj. Thanks a lot for giving your time and giving this opportunity for us to learn something new from you. Yeah, now Manoj, all stage is yours now.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, Naveen. That was a very generous and kind introduction that I've ever had. Hoping you all can see me. I've just turned on my video just to say a quick hi, and then I'll quickly turn off when we start the actual session. And I think one quick introduction before we start, probably in a housekeeping instruction. So. Probably you'll find two options: a chat and then Q&A. For any questions that you might have, please start asking questions as we progress. And if someone feels the same question has been asked by someone else, you don't need to repeat again. I think you should find an upvote option there. I think the most upvoted option question will be on the top, and which Naveen can pick up when we actually start the Q&A. Right? Great. Let's get started. I will quickly stop my video and then we'll start. All right. Thanks again, Naveen, and thanks again, everyone who's been joining and also watching live in YouTube. For those of you on Zoom, it'll be nice to see you. Can you just ping me which country you're joining from? It'll be really nice to see where you're coming from. And then we'll quickly jump on. Oh my God, that's really great to see. There's already people joining from India. I cannot read almost. It's very quick.
Yeah, so people are joining from Hyderabad, Ireland, Canada, Australia. Okay, that's really great. Atlanta, USA. Oh yeah, that's great. I'm joining from Goa actually, so you can see my background.
I think in that case you would have seen my background. I'm still in not in a work from home mode yet. I think
Yeah.
it's just a ThoughtWorks background.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, cheers,
So yeah,
folks. Thanks a lot again. Thanks. I think keep coming. Let's keep the chat forum very interactive, and strictly keep the Q&A forum only for questions. And with that, we'll get started. Today we're going to look at getting started with GraphQL and testing. So this is going to be more of a introductory and I would say a primer course on GraphQL, and then we'll of course touch upon how do you test GraphQL, right? Um, so I think Naveen already gave a very generous introduction about me. I'll just keep it anyway for a couple of seconds here. This is, you got my Twitter, GitHub, LinkedIn, and my blog URL out there. And I'm very passionate towards open source, and I've been contributing to Selenium for about 8-9 years now, ranging from contributing to documentation, Docker, a little bit of JavaScript bindings, and recently got in an Appium commit bit. I've been contributing to Python bindings as well as C Sharp. And apart from that, I've been contributing to other tools. I would say a little bit patches, Beat Protractors, Serenity, ng WebDriver, Fluent, Selenium. And these are a couple of tools that I've had my hands on throughout the year, throughout my career, and got an opportunity to contribute back to the project as well. And apart from that, I'm really keen and into accessibility. I do research all the time during my free time on accessibility, and even last month during GAD, I spoke around accessibility. And I think in personal life, I enjoy running long distance, 10 kilometers, 5, and then 21, and also love spending time with my family. So that's about me, and I work at ThoughtWorks as a principal consultant. Uh, let's get started. GraphQL. So what is GraphQL? So GraphQL is a query language, right? As the name mentions, GraphQL, and the QL stands for query language, and which is a way for you to query some data, right? And as it is written on there on the first point, it's an API specification standard and an open source data query and manipulation language. So what do you mean by API specification standard, right? So is it more like REST and API? I think the moment you heard about GraphQL, you've been curious and you'd have been keen to look around what is GraphQL and how it is different from REST. Of course, I think whatever you would have seen is real, right? So a lot of people are migrating from REST to GraphQL. I think it totally depends upon the scenario and what is the technical infrastructure, and what are you aiming towards, right? Is it microservices environment or any other environment for that matter? So GraphQL is an API specification standard. So when we mean that, so GraphQL is a specification standard, right? So considering we are all QAs and coming from an automation background, I would say the closest possible analogy for us would be to think of a WebDriver specification, right? So you would all know that we were using a JSON wire protocol in Selenium, and then we moved on to W3C WebDriver protocol, and WebDriver protocol is nothing but a W3C standard, which is a specification, right? So that specification is a set of rules or protocols that any browser can use, which is a way of a standard that any browser drivers would follow. So similarly, GraphQL is a specification standard, right? So considering, WebDriver is a specification, Selenium WebDriver, right? Whatever you've been using. So seleniumhq.org was the old URL, and now it's selenium.dev. So selenium.dev, whatever client bindings that you see is a implementation of the API specification, right? So hear me clearly here. There's two different words. One is specification and one is implementation, right? Specification is nothing but you could just consider it as a rule book, and implementation is you read that rule and implement the software whatever you would want. And one other W3C implementation that we all know is WebDriver IO, right? So WebDriver IO is by Christian Bruman from Sauce Lab. So he's been doing that, and that is also one other implementation um, of WebDriver spec. And so now you would have understood. So GraphQL is nothing but a specification standard. So that is one important thing that you should, very clearly understand. And it is open source, right? So and it is open source. Anyone could use it. And as you see, it is a query and a manipulation language, right? And it also has a server side where you'll be able to query the data and then get a response, which is typically the REST and request. And one other thing that you should know definitely before we jump onto the core concepts later in the slides and in this webinar is what you ask is what you get. I think probably you would have heard from HTML and all other is what you see is what you get, something around that, right? This week, right? I kind of, turned around that into GraphQL. So that perfectly fit in here. It's like what you ask is what you get. That's exactly the purpose of GraphQL and why it came in here. So GraphQL allows declarative data fetching, right? Where a client can specify what data it needs from an API. So it's mostly a client-driven architecture, I would say, where you say you want an data of two things instead of five things. You request only two, and you get exactly two instead of five. Right now, it's very unclear, and I'm just making it by numbers, but definitely I have some examples that you really help you understand what it is, right? So let's further go ahead. It's kind of I directly jumped onto GraphQL, right? Which is very unusual in my style of delivering a conference talk or any webinar for that matter. So it's always good to step back and revisit the basics, right? So in this case, GraphQL, we all know it's an API. It's a specification related to API, right? So firstly, what is an API? So APIs has different meanings in different formats, right? So in nutshell, it's an application programming interface, right? So you would say which defines an interaction between a multiple software intermediaries. So as a textbook definition, right? So I think this GIF here as a video, it'll help you understand. So imagine I want you all the attendees out here. So imagine that you're going to a restaurant and you booked a table and you're sitting on there, and you of course have a menu, and there is a kitchen which prepares the food, and where is the connect, right? So what makes you to eat the food that you wanted, right? So that is where a waiter comes into picture, which is where the waiter is an intermediary where you ask him the food that you wanted, and as you see the video, the waiter goes up to the kitchen, and then when the food is ready, he gets back and delivers the food to you. So this is typically more around, you request something, and through an stream, which is an API, and it goes to a system that gives the data back to you, and it comes in as a response to you, right? So, and the menu, whatever you see here, I think in a GraphQL perspective, you can consider, kind of a schema, right? So, which is something that I will touch upon very quickly. So, I just want you to, when I talk about schema, I will refer this example. So, I would, want you all to remember the menu here and the waiter, and of course, you as a person who's wanting to eat, sitting out in the restaurant, and there is also a kitchen which is ready to prepare the food that you'd wanted. So I think coming back to the computer definition of what is a typical API would do is there is a client, which is of course you as an end user using a laptop or a mobile, requesting something, a data, which goes back to the REST server, which of course in turn will connect to database and fetch, get the data and put it back as a response to you, right? And I think given this situation, the world is going towards COVID. Everyone is in home. We are really fortunate enough to have everything online, right? Even you can get your pizzas delivered to your home, groceries, and if you want to go somewhere on a flight, you would easily book it through your mobile app. So that's typically how the technology has been evolved. And I think I would say the most unsung hero here is the API, which is behind the scenes, which is responsible for everything that is happening behind the scenes, right? So if API isn't there, we wouldn't be having the pleasure of doing anything over the technology. So API, in a nutshell, is request. You request something, and it hits the system, the end system, and gets response to you back, right? So now, API is not very new, right? So I think over the course of year, there has been something called SOAP services. As you know, it's a service-oriented architecture. There was SOAP WSDL, and you would had a schema. You would use tools like SOAP UI for SOAP testing, and then later REST APIs came, which has been dominating for around 10 years now in the industry. And I think after that, really, what is hitting the market is really the GraphQL, right? Which is why the reason we are looking at what GraphQL is, and it's very important to understand what GraphQL is. And there's also something called remote procedure call, which is from Google. Something called gRPC is also one other way of defining your APIs, right? So anyway, that's not in context for us today, but let's quickly look at REST versus GraphQL. So assuming most of you would have had an opportunity to work on REST API using any other tools like REST Assured, REST Sharp, even curl for that matter, right? Any software systems you would use, you'd have at least at once you would have been interacted with an API, which is mostly the REST, usually 80-90% right now. Still the legacy systems might have SOAP services, right? So it's always good to understand the difference between REST versus GraphQL before we move on, right? Here is a pictorial representation. What it shows, I want you to look at the hash one here, right? So this has a client which over the cloud, where we request and some response comes back, right? So as you see, the user slash ID is being highlighted here, whereas in this case, users ID post is highlighted, and in this case, users ID followers is highlighted, right? So what it really means is that so there is an REST API, three REST APIs, I would say, three endpoints where it has ID, which returns only the particular ID of an user, and then there is another endpoint where after knowing the ID, you would want to know what is the post, right? So this is basically a blogging platform REST API, where firstly you wanted to get ID of an user, and using that unique ID, you get how many posts and what are the posts that the user has published, and also get to know for that particular ID, what are the how many number of followers that user has, right? So typically you see, if you see this, there is totally three REST calls that has been made here, right? So with REST, you have to make three requests to different endpoints to fetch the required data. You're also overfetching since the endpoint is written additional information that's not needed, right? On the flip side, if you see on the right-hand side, in GraphQL, you would simply send a single query oops, to the GraphQL server that includes the concrete data requirements, and then the server responds with a JSON object where the requirements are fulfilled, right? So if you see the top portion above the request in the cloud here is really all about how do you use GraphQL to query some data, right? It's simple as that. So you have a query, so it has a particular a syntax, right? As everything it goes in programming. It has a syntax. So likewise, GraphQL has a syntax that needs to be followed, which is, I think, for you now to look at it. So it is very simple, right? So going back to the first slide that I showed, what you ask is what you get, and using a very easy and a neat manner, right? As you see, it's only one single endpoint and one query. You're not hitting any other endpoints. It's just one endpoint, and you get the desired data. But whereas on the rest, if you see, we are hitting the first one, user's ID, and of course you get an ID, not only ID, but you also get the name, you also get the address, birthday, which is all not required, right? So which is a serious problem of performance when it comes to architectures. Large companies having a very large architecture and having multiple REST APIs, and there's also this is what we called as an overfetching and then underfetching, right? So which we'll shortly see in the next slide. But I hope this gave you an idea of what is it like for you when someone works in the REST way of APIs and then a GraphQL, right? It's very simple and it's very neat. So let's look at some of the problems and why GraphQL was actually developed, right? Of course, this invention came from Facebook, keeping in mind that REST isn't helpful when Facebook decided to have the mobile version of Facebook. Earlier, if you remember, the web version of Facebook was actually what was available to users, not the mobile app. But later it came in, and they figured out it isn't using the REST way of things, isn't the way of getting the data. It slows down the process, right? Since it's mobile, you would imagine it's a small scale device. Probably you would be under a poor network. Back in time we had only 2Gs and 3Gs. Gladly now we have 4G and even 5G now. You could imagine, right? So Facebook being a data heavy application, with a 2G, how much information that you would get through. And it also had a performance hit, and Facebook was heavily under pump to have those many resources, and which is why they came up with something as a way of new way of defining APIs and getting data. Fetching data is the GraphQL, right? And as you see, data fetching is one of the significant improvements in GraphQL, where you ask the data and you precisely get that. There is no more under and over fetching. So I think on the previous slide I explained to you what is under fetching and over fetching. I think in a nutshell, I think the literary meaning it goes, you're not getting anything extra, you're not getting anything less, right? So you get exactly what you ask for, which is good, always good. um, Moving on further, I think in terms of data operation, as you would have seen, by the way, all the slides has a picture, which is closely relating to what I have in as a concept. I hope that makes sense. Now, in data operation, of course, in REST API, as I think everyone would be knowing, that each and everything is resource, right? And is represented with its own endpoints. And it's very prevalent and obvious that it would have multiple endpoints, right? And in GraphQL, everything is perceived as a graph and it's connected to a single endpoint. So if you look at the GraphQL logo, I think if you missed looking at the GraphQL logo, you can Google it, or even I will have it next set of slides. And the logo itself represents what GraphQL is all about, right? So everything is perceived as a graph, and it's connected as a single endpoint. So you'll only have, no matter how big your architecture is, you'll have only one single point, and everything would be inclusive within that endpoint. So, right, how cool is that? While it sounds cool, it may also be leading into some sort of problems, right? And of course, GraphQL is new and it's evolving, so there's ways that you can work around it as well, right? And one other major difference is versioning. So I think mainly for testers, we'd have all been fed up at one stage. Some product owner comes in and wants to make change, and for developer, it's easy to make version 1, version 2, and version 3. But I think when regression kicks in, when I think if version 1 is completely removed, that's fine. But when it's still there, you got to test that, right? So the testing efforts for testing all different versions is still matter. And in GraphQL, it's simple and easy, right? um, it has something called schema, right? Which I'll go through it. And if one of the fields or some features, like say if you in the previous example we saw around the blogging REST API, where it had followers, say that followers is not something we don't want it to show to the users, you can simply deprecate that and still continue with the same endpoint. There's nothing more, nothing less, right? From a testing perspective, you don't have to change your strategy, you don't have to refactor your tests, and same does the developer. And that's how typically it helps. And I think this picture in this slide that gives you an overall picture of the architectural difference between the REST and GraphQL, how it looks like. And I think while going through these set of slides, I think if you've been hearing about microservices architecture, you've been thinking, is it closely related to that? How GraphQL does GraphQL intervene with microservices? If that question pops up, that's awesome, right? It's very valid. So GraphQL sits on top of all these, right? So as I said earlier, GraphQL is not something that will be completely replaced by REST. Typically, whatever you see in this box here, could be different system code that has different endpoints and different REST APIs, and then collectively you can have a GraphQL that wraps all different endpoints and have as in one single point where the client request from the front end, right? I hope that made sense. So just to give an example again, like consider as a chocolate, right? So your chocolate, eclairs, dairy milk. I think those of you from India you'd be knowing what that is, where you have say probably the cream inside and then the chocolate itself and then a wrapper on top of it, right? So I think it's the same concept here, where you have different REST APIs, and I think you have a wrapper on top of it, which has been exposed to the external, where it has been exposed as a single endpoint, and then the client queries that. And I think in that way, GraphQL and REST can go hand in hand. It's not a complete replacement. This is something for your reference. I think in the middle, it shows about what the architecture. I think in GraphQL on the left, and then the rest, it's a client driven, but whereas in REST, it's completely server driven, and both are based on HTTP. And if we take in specifications, REST has multiple specifications. I think Open API is something very common. And I think in GraphQL, it's all about schema definition language, which is in short called as SDL. GraphQL is all about SDL, and the data is actually fetched through the query language, which is what I explained earlier. So the graph and the QL, and the QL stands for the query language, and you fetch the data using that query. And of course, in REST API, it is available as a resources over HTTP, and you get it via the URI. And if you talk about data types, GraphQL has a very strong type checks, which is very good, unlike REST, where it has multiple type formats, which leads to multiple confusions and multiple data type, right? So if a developer, changes one data type where you're not aware of something, and it goes up for a toss. And in terms of performance, it's fast in terms of GraphQL, and in REST it's slower because of the overfetching and multiple network calls, going back and forth. And versioning, in from a versioning perspective, as we looked earlier, REST allows versioning, which also it's like an Achilles heel. So if you know about Achilles heel, I think the strength of one is also leading to its downfall, right? So I think the same concept applies here, where versioning is APIs of allowed, but also that comes with its cons. And operations, how do you typically operate and fetch the data? In GraphQL, it's all about queries and mutations. And I think we will have a different set of slides that talks about in detail what are queries and mutations. And in REST API, it's all about CRUD service, right? So create, update, and delete. So you would imagine the equivalent in GraphQL would be to query and mutations. And payload is still JSON. And from a community perspective, it's fast growing. It's been used by companies like Facebook, Netflix, Yelp, Airbnb, I believe Expedia to some extent, and a lot of top companies like that, and GitHub as well. And it's been backed by Linux Foundation. So I'm not sure if you know about Linux Foundation, but you should do check out. That's where most of the projects like Kubernetes, Docker is coming from, Node.js partly as well. And it's well established in terms of REST because it's been there for 10 years now. I hope that gave you an idea of what GraphQL is so far. Just to quickly summarize before we move on to the next, I would say probably a next chapter. We talked about in a nutshell what GraphQL is, and what is the difference between working in REST and GraphQL, and architecturally how it is different. And I think this table would really clearly give you an idea of how things different in multiple angles, right? Let's move on. Let's look at GraphQL again, right? So I just repeated the same slide as we saw earlier. It's an API specification standard. What you ask is what you get. And it's a declarative data fetching where a client can specify what data it's need from an API. Right. So moving on further, right? So GraphQL in nutshell has two components, right? So a server and a client. right? So a client, you could imagine, it is a component where probably you could imagine like a GUI, right? Where you send a post request with the payload to the GraphQL server. And the server component is nothing but it accepts the request and sends back the data. And in terms of what are the server components, schema and resolvers, right? So I'm hoping this gave you an idea of what is a client specifically means in a GraphQL and a server means in GraphQL. So those examples, schema and resolvers, don't worry about it. We will have slides that talk so explicitly about it. For now, just imagine that what is GraphQL? If someone asks you, you can say it is a query language, it is an API spec, and blah blah blah. And mainly, you should touch upon what is a client and what is a server. And client is all about a place where you query and you fetch the data, and server is return backs. And what GraphQL used to sense that data back is all about schema and resolvers, and we will look into it. So what does the typical GraphQL workflow looks like, right? So imagine this GIF that is playing out here. So on the left hand side, you have query movies name. So that is all about me querying some data. So you could imagine the same as you would be doing in a REST API, unlike GraphQL query language looks like a stringified JSON. It would look like a JSON, but it's not exactly JSON format. So you can't actually copy paste and use it anywhere else. So what happens? So the moment I query, right? So I have a client. I think in the previous slide we saw about the GraphQL. So just imagine this name example, GraphIQL. So right, it's GraphQL. So using GraphQL, I query a data, query movies name from a client, and it hits the GraphQL server. And on the very right hand side, in a moment, you see data, movies, the matrix. The inception is all about the data, and then whatever data that we want comes back to the client. So as you see, firstly, you query the data. Secondly, the GraphQL would generate a payload and has a response with the data in a JSON format, and it is ready. And then finally, the server would send the payback payload back to the client and the data, and is displayed out to the client. So that's typically is all about, right? So you request, the data gets processed and it gets back. And I think it's common in any API, but really the thing here is all about for you to understand how you would query, right? So it starts with query and then movies and names, and I will look at what is movies and names shortly, right? So hoping that gave you an idea of what GraphQL is. Let's look at components of GraphQL, right? So as I told you earlier, schema is one of the components, right? Schema serves as a contract between the client and the server to define how the client can access the data. Right. So once the schema is defined, the teams working on front end and the back ends can do their work without further communication, since both are aware of the definite structure of the data that's sent over the network. Right. So this is very cool, and that if you recollect, if you're working and if you know about microservices, I think it's closely related to that concept as well. But don't confuse contract testing. You can still do it, right? So GraphQL and then contract testing can go hand in hand as well. But for now, schemas, as I said, it's like a menu, as we saw in the first example, where you're sitting in a restaurant, you're looking at a menu. The schema is telling, right? So if you look at a menu, if you're non-vegetarian, you have chicken, mutton options, and if you're vegetarian, you have paneer, gobi, and many other options. And it comes with various flavors and various options, right? You can get it less spicy, more spicy, and things like that. And exactly the same concept applies here, where the root query type on the very left hand side in the screen is all about um, the um, the way that you can operate, right? So so in a nutshell, GraphQL is a single endpoint. So single endpoint is still there, but using that single endpoint, what are the things that you can query for? So you can query for different movies available, different actors available, and also you get a list of movies and actors, right? So that's what it's all about. So I actually developed a GraphQL server component, and it's available in my local, which I'll show it in a short demo, which will touch upon all this. And if you look at what movie, right? So movie has ID, name, genre, actor, and actor also has ID, name, age, and movies, right? So when you query for a movie, you get the ID of the movie, the name of the movie, and then the genre. And likewise in actor, you get the ID, name, and then age. And also you get, people wanted to query, say, I say Tom Hanks being an actor, Hollywood actor, I wanted a list of movies, right? So you can query that, and the server would get back a response to you. um, and next is query, right, which is exactly what I was talking about. Queries are a way to get the data from the server, so which is actually the first in the workflow. As the GIF it plays, as you see, GraphQL is a client component in GraphQL, where it is a GUI where you can query the data. As you see, I query and then I ask for a movies actually, and then inside movies I'm asking, I want the name of the movie as well as genre of the movie, and then also I think that's it. And then on the response, you get the whole list of data, right? In this case, if it has been rest, you would have been already fiddling with two endpoints and then do. And as you see, root query is an endpoint that is exposed to the end users, right? So as we saw here, so root query is a movie, actor, movies, and actor. So these are the four different ways that has been exposed to the end user, and you can query that. So this is a very simple, it's at least slightly better than the hello world example that I can show it to you guys. But in any large scale systems, if you're looking at a schema and if you're getting frustrated and if you don't understand what it's all about, I think the first thing that you should look for is root query type. So if looking at a root query type, you would understand what are the things that you can typically query for, and then some sort of, you can use some sort of visualization schema visualization tools like this to get, and then you can find the flow of the data and what are the typically things that it's available, right? I hope that made sense. And then query, we already talked about it. And then mutations, right? So we saw in mutations, and I think in the REST versus GraphQL slide, we saw in REST it is all about create, read, update, and delete, whereas in GraphQL it's all about mutation, right? So that's exactly what it is. So in REST API, you would be using all verbs like get, post, push, patch, and delete to do all the create, read, update, and delete. But whereas in mutation, it's just mutation, right? So you don't have any chatty verbs like that. And how would you define mutation is all about this, right? So in the earlier slide, this one you saw about the movie and actor, right? So these are the two. Of course, if I wanted to add a new entry to my database using an API, say let's consider Rajinikanth, right? So who would not be knowing Rajinikanth in India? So let's take, we wanted to add Rajinikanth as an actor and a movie that he acted. You would be typically using add movie and add actor, right? So if you see the ID, and it has got a string, and exclamation marks means that it's a mandatory field, right? So, and the name, so you cannot add a movie without an ID and then a name, and you cannot add an actor without a name and an age, which I've made it as mandatory. It's really important. So that's all mutation is all about. So you could imagine you can have update movie, update actor, delete movie and delete actor, and so on, right? So typically up to you. So but just for simplicity purposes, I just had just an addition of these mutations. But I think in real life architecture, if you have been looking at GraphQL endpoints, you would be having much more than what you see. But I think all in all, nutshell, this is what it's all about. And there's also something called subscriptions, right? So we are now looking at core components of GraphQL, right? So we looked at what is schema, we looked what is query, we looked at what is mutations, we are looking at what is subscriptions. And subscription is, this is all an important factor, right? So given you have a database, I want to subscribe, right? It's all about subscription. So say Naveen, he's having a YouTube channel, he recently got the YouTube Silver Award, and that is because he's been having 100K subscribers and followers, right? So the moment he goes live, you all get notified. That's entirely is all about subscription. So in GraphQL, you can use the subscriptions, and you can get notified by the server whenever user adds something. Demo time quickly. So as I mentioned here, I have a GraphQL code base that I developed here. So as you see, let's look at it. So we have a server folder, and inside server folder, as you see, I've developed this GraphQL server component using Node.js, and so that you see package.json, and two main files here is app.js, and then inside schema you have schema.js, and then GQL, which is nothing but a GraphQL file, right? So if any GraphQL project that you're moving on to, I think this definitely they should have something either GQL or GraphQL extension. and this is what it's all about, right? So we talked about query. So typically users can query on movie, actor, movies, and actor, and they can also query for actor, movie. And so this is nothing but, you basically declare and define what are the type it's going to use, so that it doesn't gets overhead when a lot of people working on the same things. And there's also mutation, as we saw earlier, add movie and add actor, right? So now all of these things is going to have a source code associated with this, right? Of course, without that it won't work, and which is what is available in schema.js, right? So as you see, GraphQL has so movie type is nothing but movie is all about an actor type. And root query, as we saw, it had, if you remember, we had four different endpoints that was exposed to user, which was movie, actor, and then movies, and then actors, right? So typically root query has all of its core components here. And we also looked at resolvers at one stage. I think that is all it talks about, resolve. So resolvers are nothing but a pure functions that would actually get the data that you're exactly asking for, right? So which is actually the main backbone behind the query. And of course mutation has its own code as well. Anyway, let's not jump into the code. So we looked at how the schema looks like and how the code for the schema looks like. And in the app.js, it's very simple. We are using a React app and extras, and we're also using a MongoDB. And GraphQL is where it is served on GraphQL endpoint, right? So as you see here, this is where it's all about. So let me refresh the screen. Oops, I think it's not running. Let's check me where I am. Okay, that's good. And then let me do npm start. So I'm using nodemon, which means that whenever I change something, this will keep on looking at it, and then we will have those reflecting on a refresh. Great. So this is what a GraphQL looks like. So GraphQL is actually coming from the core GraphQL component itself, and it's available only for JavaScript. So if your project is not using JavaScript for GraphQL, you will have other tools that you can use. But in JavaScript, you have this neat way of querying. So I think let's quickly look at these. So if you look at on the docs on the right hand side, it gives you a documentation explorer where it tells you a GraphQL schema provides a root type for each kind of operation. And I think one of the main things that I missed talking about earlier is documentation, right? In REST API, you would be wanting to have a lot of API, and then you put it on Swagger and you see what the documentation looks like. But whereas in GraphQL, you don't need to extensively maintain any documentation. It's all inbuilt. It derives the documentation for you. And I think in this case, if you see it, really the code base is all about just schema.js and app.js. Just simple as it is, nothing more, nothing less. And it's still, it is able to provide the documentation for us, where you have look into query, and then you can query for a movie with an valid ID. You can query for an actor with an valid ID, and then you can query entire movies and entire actors. And if you go back, and there's also mutation where you can add an actor and add a movie, right? So let's quickly write in a query. So you can even do something like this query. And inside, I wanted movies and just the name for now, right? So the moment I give, and so this is all the different movies that I had: The Matrix, Inception. That's good. And I know I also wanted the actor name. So let me add an actor. And inside that, I wanted the name of the actor. And there you go. You get the name of the movie as well as the name of the actor. And you can even get age of the things, and also you can add more like genre, what type of genre. And this is all about, right? So you could imagine you'd be doing 2 or 3 different endpoints in REST API, and that's it is all about, right? And it also, as you proceed, you can see a lot of things that I did, and you can even specify a different movie. I can quickly click on it, and you get a specific movie ID and the name of it, and then actor. So a lot of different things that you can do, different permutations and combinations. And I think this is how you would query a data, right? So and I hope that gives you clearly an idea of how is it to work in GraphQL. If that is your question, this is it. Whatever you're seeing is and will be answering that, where typically this is how easy it is to query the data. Nothing more, nothing less. You exactly get what you ask for, right? So if you remember, movie also has something like a genre here, which I didn't ask. But whereas in REST API, if movie was an endpoint, you'd be getting all this data, right? So that's how typically it goes like, and it provides a huge performance improvement, right? You could imagine looking at different services. And given we had, let's quickly go to this. This is how it is. Okay, great. Let's mutation. Let's look at mutation, right? So I think I should be having here mutations just for simplicity purposes. We talked about Rajnikant, but nothing is there in the database, right? So let's add Talaivar into the database. We have an add actor. It takes name and an age because those are the two important mandatory fields, and that is there. And let's click on this one. It goes and available as uh, uh, name and age. And as I said, it's using a MongoDB, right? So I have my production MongoDB, which is running up here. So if I go and look in collections, it should actually populate the actor that is available in this. There you go. You see Rajinikanth and then the 69. So since we use MongoDB, it provides a unique ID for every actor, right? So I'm just gonna copy the actor ID and come back to my GraphQL here. And I wanted to do, say, add a movie. So I think in that case, let's look at what movie does. So it takes name. So name, what's your favorite Rajinikanth movie, Naveen?
Okay. I think Rajnikant movie. The recent one is
Recent
that
one was Darbar.
Darbar, right? Yeah. And before that, that robot movie. I think some. I don't
Ah,
remember
great.
exactly. Yeah.
Great, great, great that you follow South Indian movies. Anyway, so let's add my favorite movie. So it's all-time favorite. Let's add Basha and so genre. So it's mostly an action film, and then it also takes an actor ID. Um, so in that case, is all about this. Let's do equal to and something like this. It's not an equal to like this, right? So, and then so name, and then you wanted genre, and that's all about it, right? So the moment I do it, bang on, it's added. So let's go back and look at it in movies list. But whatever we have added should be coming up here. There you go. So Basha action, and then it has an actor ID. So there you go, guys. I think that's how simple GraphQL looks like. And I think in real time, you think if you want to add more data instead of fiddling with a lot of REST APIs, and that's how typically you work within GraphQL. I hope that gave you a sense of how things look like, and I think whatever response that comes back here is actually a JSON. Let's quickly go back to the slides up here. And I've just added this slide at a very last minute, and I think GraphQL itself uses AST, which is an abstract syntax tree, which uses as a parser to break down between different queries and look at it. I think you can take a look at it later. Let's come back, looking at the important things, testing GraphQL. So I think before jumping on to testing GraphQL, you've been knowing about testing methodologies and different metaphors that tells you what are the things that you could do. There's a testing pyramid, and there is also champion trophy. Champion trophy looking like it's called the testing trophy. I think there is a small triangle up here is missing, but I think that we could visualize something is there. I think the only difference between the both of these is in the testing trophy at the bottom you have a static layer, and then followed by unit integration, and then the inverted pyramid will have the exploratory testing up here. And I think testing pyramid doesn't need an introduction, so you could think of unit integration and then E2E. So what is the recommended model that you would ask me? If you ask me, I think you can use mix and match of both, and I think really you should use whatever it works for you in an environment. And I think GraphQL in itself has a schema, as we saw earlier, and it has type and it has query. You can declare it as a string or an int and whatnot, right? So it also makes sense to tech for static types. So, and I'm gonna look at using the testing trophy here, right? So in a nutshell, what are the things that you can test in GraphQL? So you can test for schema, you can use mocks at an unit testing level, at an integration testing level, you can use schema plus resolvers. And at an exploratory level, you can use the GraphQL, whatever that I've just showed you, and do some exploratory to make sure that the data is coming as expected. And I think this gives you an idea of what are the different levels and you can do. At static tabs, as you see, you can use, any linting tools. There are many linting tools like schema, GraphQL checker, that you could use to make sure no one is violating a different type, instead of using the defined data type, you're using something else. Let's look at in deep, right? So let's start from probably a bottom up approach. Yeah, let's do exploratory. This is also something that you could do with Postman, right? So again, Postman doesn't need introduction. So with Postman, it's very simple. You could using, if you click on the APIs tab here, you can upload the schema for this. So and then you can query the data, right? I think I have it ready up here. Let me quickly show you. It's just starting up. Right. Right. So on inside APIs, you can see a movie actor is a GraphQL schema that I've already added. And inside that, you see this. And then inside the workspace, oops. And if you look at the collections, I have a lot of collections. So you can look at schema details in here. You can also have mocks overs and total test ups here. And on this, you can see I have three different things that you can do. And as I said, right, so in GraphQL, it's all about post methods, right? So you use the body to send in your query parameter, and this likewise the same for different methods up here. And then you query, and then you get the data back. So that's how simple it is. And also you can use the tests tab, and I don't know, for some reasons it doesn't come in to the workspace. I'm in my workspace. I think it should be in my runner. I should have already run some tests. You can do the test project GraphQL, and then I already have some tests, and it's running already. It's hitting the production server that I have. And I think you should notice one interesting thing out here. Let's wait for this test to finish, and then there you go. So we had two test pass and then one fail, right? So even though it failed, I think you should definitely notice the status code is 200. So that is one definite cache that you should remember, right? So in GraphQL, as far as I know, I think you shouldn't, when you're writing your automated tests, you shouldn't check for status code, because even it fails, it gives you status code 200, which is very scary, isn't it? But GraphQL allows you to define custom error codes, and you can define custom error codes and then use that to verify, instead of blindly verifying status code 200. Okay, so that's one catch, and that's how you would work with Postman. Let's quickly jump on. So testing GraphQL in JavaScript, right? So we had the a GraphQL server component developed in JavaScript, and you can, if I think it makes sense to use the same language to test it, right? So if your team is using JavaScript to develop GraphQL components, you can use the same, and you can get data and fetch data using multiple ways, right? So one of the ways is using isomorphic fetch, where fetch is a function. If you see, it takes an endpoint, and you do a post method which takes headers, and then in a body you send it as a stringified version of the query, where in this case, if you see query movies name and genre, that's all I'm getting. And then you get a response in a JSON, and then simply print it out. And if you wanted to validate a particular data that comes back, you can very well do that as well. And one other thing that you can do is with Apollo Client Fetch. So Apollo is a company which has their own libraries developed on top of GraphQL. As I said, GraphQL is an API spec, so anyone can come up with their own version, right? So Facebook have their own version, and Netflix, developed their own version called Falcor, which is another GraphQL. So I think coming back to this point, so using Apollo Client Fetch, you could use fetch and then send in the URI and then pass in the movie ID. And here for simplicity purposes I've just passed in log console.log, but you can typically verify the data that's coming in as well, right? So all these code examples that is just available as a screenshot for you, but don't worry, it's available in GitHub, and I will share it on Twitter and LinkedIn post the webinar, and you can start the repo if you like it. And you can, it's tied along with the GraphQL server, so it has a neat, nice readme instructions. So you clone the repo, npm install, npm start, you will have the GraphQL server up and running, and then you can look into the test folder and then start doing things. And before we jump onto crazy GraphQL, or I'll just take a quick grab at it. So Easy GraphQL is another library from someone who's also apparently working on Cypress, I believe, which is a neat node module that allows you to mock your schema, test against schema, check whether the arguments are valid, and these are the typical things that you could do, right? And how would you go with using Easy GraphQL Tester? So if you're coming from JavaScript background, this should be pretty easy for you to understand. So you have a couple of import statements, and of course you need to read the schema file and have it as part of schema code. And all it needs is create a constant tester, and then object, and then pass the schema code. So once you pass the schema code into Easy GraphQL Tester, when you invoke tester, you have the whole schema and you can start writing test, right? So this is a simple Mocha example, as you see here, where it has a describe and an init block, and then there is a query which you can do. And then first argument is true because the query is valid, and the second argument is the to test whether your query. So you can even have a query that is invalid and then have this as a false, and make sure that it is testing against the schema, and you're making sure it is valid, right? So this is one way of testing your schema. So let's quickly look at the code base up here. So inside the test folder, so this is what I was talking about, isomorphic fetch, where it is there. I'll open a new terminal and I quickly run it for you. um, so this is just a node file, isn't it? Node and then dot slash test.
Manoj, can you please a little zoom in? Your font size is a little.
Okay. Okay, now we have test in here. That's great. So I'm not sure if let's do plus. Okay, hoping now it's fine. Let's clear it up. There's one bad thing about Visual Studio Code, right? So does it has presentation mode? No, so IntelliJ has. Okay, anyway, so I'm gonna do node and then dot slash test, and inside that I can do isomorphic fetch dot test, and then you bang on, you get an easy movies list as well, and including it has the Basha, the movie that we just added. And the other thing that you can do is test for Apollo fetch. Which is more or less the same, where you have name, ID, name, whatever that you requested that comes up here. Yep, there you go, the same example that you saw on the screenshot. And this is the easy GraphQL tester example that I showed you, where it is using Mocha. So I'm using a before function here, where I have a tester and then passing the schema code up here, where the schema code is where I'm reading up here, and then passing into easy GraphQL tester. And there are different things that you get that I'm doing here, right? So one, I'm testing for schema, which we saw in the example, where it has a query, and then you simply use tester. And then I've just made a small mistake here. Instead of genre, I just deleted this yen and I don't want this to be passed, right? So because if in production, if someone is able to query this, I think it'll performance and I think everything will be jammed. I am testing it for false, and I can even check the types I'm passing in. As you also saw, it movie as an ID, it accepts ID and a string, and you can verify. I can remove the string and then check whether an ID it works or not. And same testing mutations. You can even pass the mutations within variables, right? So tester.test, whatever you see here in say 10 ID name genre has variable up here, and then you can test for mutations. um, and again, I'm just checking for an invalid mutation, right? So I know I quickly rushed through looking at this example because there's nothing in here except the fact that we are testing against the actual schema, right? So this is something that you could do at both unit and integration level. So if you wanted to do against a mock server, you can even do that. Easy GraphQL tester allows you to do that. And there is also something called super test, which is something that you could use where you can actually send the base URL of the GraphQL along with its endpoint, and then query the actual endpoint, and then they get the data. And for now, I'm just printing it console.log, and you can verify like how you would be typically doing in REST assured or REST sharp or whatever API testing tool background that you're coming from, right? So these are couple of options available to test. And I think just the key takeaway here is you should test for schemas, you should test for mutations, and you can do that by various ways, like using simple node module called isomorphic fetch, using Apollo fetch, and also using super test, where super test would allow you to hit the actual endpoint, get the data, and then verify it, right? And these are a couple of things that you could do from an JavaScript way of things. And coming to Java background, most of you I believe would be coming from Java background, using REST Assure, right? So as we all know, this is a query that we did, and you can't just copy and paste it over your body or add as a parameter and then do, right? So you should convert this GraphQL query into a JSON format and then do it, right? So one quick example that I can show you here is I can actually inspect and then go to network tab and history. I can do movies. The moment I do one click, have here, and then you can see up here the request headers has, and then you can see this is the payload that goes in, right? So this is you should make sure you can, one way of doing it is to copy this and put it up as an input to your rest assured if you're using that. So I have that as an example, rest assured. So in rest assured, as you see, I did before class, I have request specification where I'm setting the base URI, and I'm hoping this is visible. Um, yeah, this is a lot more visible now. In the before class, as you see, I'm having local host and then 4040 and then building it. And it's all about simply, in the body, I'm just simply copy pasting the query. And then, as I said, it's always a post operation with an endpoint of GraphQL. And in this case, I'm checking just a status code. I know I told you it's not the best way to do it. But again, end of the day, if you have the proper models and if you know what sort of data would come back, you can typically verify exactly what is the data that is coming back and is it exactly what it should come back, and you can assert using different libraries and you can do it, right? So one other thing that you can do in is using karate. So if you're using karate for testing, this is going to be simple. Karate is a DSL using given when then built on top of cucumber. You can pass in the actual query. In this case, it is having a movie and then a couple of data that I wanted, and request query, and then passing in this query coming up here. And as I said, it's a post method, and then I just want to print it out so that I make sure I see it visually. And then I can actually karate has a nice fuzzy and smart matching that we can do, where in this case I know I am querying for this movie with an ID, and I want to assert the name is the matrix and the actor is the Keanu Reeves. And similarly, I have one more where query that completely gets back all my things like movie's name, right? So let's quickly run this. So it was very fast and neat. As you see, set path query, new value. I'm hoping it's visible. So this is the data that I queried. It does all the operation, post operation, connection, typically whatever you would see in DevTools. And there is at one point where it would turn right. Here you go. So this is the actual graph query way of query. As I said, in rest assured, you want to convert it and then send it as a JSON payload. But whereas in GraphQL Karate, it has a GraphQL feature where you can even pass the raw query, and on the fly Karate would convert it as the query that it would understand. The GraphQL server would understand, and it will get back to you the result as what we wanted. There you go, right? And it will still match. If this was failed, if this match was failed, it would have been failed. So this is one way of testing GraphQL and Karate at a very easy way. And say if you're not using rest assured, I don't want to use rest assured BDD format, I don't want to use Karate DSL, I just want to use plain Java. Is there a way to do it? There is. So Vimal Selvam is a good friend. I met him in one of the Selenium conference. So he has one library called test GraphQL Java, where it's very simple. The test goes very simple like this, where you pass in the end URL, the endpoint here with the GraphQL, and you send the GraphQL payload up here. So GraphQL payload, which is coming up here, where it is available in streams, and which is up here. So this is the data that I'm querying, which is same as what you saw earlier, right? So in this case, in Karate, the ID and everything was hard coded. But in that case, here in this window, I've just parameterized it so that I can, change the IDs and make sure still I get the data that I wanted. And I can still use all my assertion libraries to make sure that the data and the movie and the name, I'm getting it as a text. And then, I wanted to test it as matrix, and I can even run this quickly to show you. And even I will, upload this source code to GitHub. You can take a look at it. So Manoj 9788 is my GitHub profile. You can follow me. Whenever I push some code, you'll be notified. So this test is finished as we were speaking, and as you see, I did a system.out.println with the JSON data, and it just printed out. So this is very simple, right? So in Java, I think if you're using rest assured, it's simple. The only manual part for you is to change the query into JSON format, and in Karate, it is straightforward. And if you don't wanted any of the BD stuff, you can still use the library from Vimal on test GraphQL, and simply assert that. And if you're coming from a .NET background, there is also one thing that you could typically do is using REST Sharp. So I have this repository already available in GitHub. You can look at it. So which is very simple way of doing a REST Sharp way of doing things. I have REST client request and a response as a private constant interface declared. As you see, it still goes in the same format, right? So the method is post call as in JSON, and then adding in as a parameter, I'm just passing in this body, right? So again, as I said, you have a GraphQL query, you need to convert it into a JSON, and then you query and then you execute it, and you can get the data, right? So again, I've just printed it out here. You can do all sort of validation that you would want it. I'm not going to run it because anyway, it's pretty straightforward, and that's what it will look like. And let me, oops, I was hoping to close the other window, but anyway. So I think in terms of I'm not doing REST, so writing test scripts. Oh, it's up here already, right? So if you're working with any sort of, let's take a look at the GraphQL example in GitHub, right? So GitHub recently moved from REST API to GraphQL, right? So if you look at, this is the API version v4, and I think if I just duplicate this tab and change this to v3, you will see these are the current REST version of API endpoints, right? So there are many endpoints that you would be getting. So I think moment if we do that, yeah, there you go. So these are the different REST endpoints that typically that you can do, right? But instead, on the GraphQL way of APIs that are exposed, it's quite it's quite simple and straightforward. Let's look at. I think Explorer should have. There you go. So this is our local GraphQL server's GraphQL, and this is GitHub's GraphQL, which is exposed to all of us. We can query, and if you look at this documentation explorer, as I said, root query is the one that you should look for, and there are multiple things that you could look for, and then query. And this is the viewer. I quickly do that, and I'm logged in as my user account, so I get my user account. So there you go. I think this is one example where companies like GitHub is moving from REST to GraphQL. So instead of multiple REST APIs that you saw on this tab, it's just one endpoint as GraphQL. In this case, it's V4 Explorer, but you can query all different sort of things. Um, that is the REST sharp way of doing. So I think in that case I've covered mostly the major languages that you'd be using: JavaScript, Java, and I think there's also, you quickly use curl to send in the post method with the body to verify. I hope that covered most of the languages that you'd be using, and got an idea of how do you typically test, and what are the components to test, and how do you test for query, how do you test for schema, how do you test mutations. And I think quite some parting thoughts that I thought it's good to have. REST is not going to be completely replaced by GraphQL, but in this case, few companies are already doing it for their purposes. Like GitHub is moving from REST to GraphQL, and GraphQL and REST can coexist in same architecture. As I said, I'm imagining you have a microservice architecture with multiple REST APIs that has in turn has multiple endpoints. You can wrap it up as a one single GraphQL. It sounds a little scary, but it's doable. Companies still doing, and it's backed by Linux Foundation. And there are more and more tools evolving, on top of GraphQL. I also have one of my projects. Like how Vimal had his own library. I'm also developing one library in JavaScript, which I'm planning to open source it as soon as I've done it. Um, don't ask me when. It really depends on the free time that I have. But I think in a nutshell, that gave you some an idea. So these are a couple of references. So if you want to learn more about, so most of my learnings are coming from these URLs. So how to GraphQL and GraphQL.org/learn. So these are the two URLs that I would definitely recommend. So go check it out if you want to learn more about queries, schemas, and all that. But as I said at the beginning of the webinar, this hope it was gave you an idea of what GraphQL is, what are the components, and satisfy the needs of the primer on GraphQL. So now you'd be able to say someone what GraphQL is all about, and what are the components it had, and how someone can test for it. And I spoke to a couple of teams at different companies using GraphQL already. As far as I've heard them, they are right now working on GraphQL Slice,
Manoj, we just lost you. We can't hear you. Guys, can you hear me or can you hear Manoj? Can anyone confirm? Okay, I think he's having some issue. Just a second, guys. Let me call him. Yeah, guys, I think he just got disconnected. He's joining it again. So then we will can take okay the final things, and then accordingly we'll proceed. With. Just wait for 2 more minutes. So I just would like to ask that, okay, guys, I hope you guys are, I mean, at least got some idea about GraphQL. It's something very interesting and very new, hot topic in the market, and then very few people actually they are aware about it. And I think the kind of things Manoj is doing in the market and with respect to automation and getting learning something from experienced people like him, I think that's a great exposure for all of us. That's a great learning for all of us. So what we can do something maybe in future also, we can pick part two also GraphQL with more and more open source APIs, how to test it for a QA point of view, for automation point of view. We can do something like this maybe, right? So, or maybe we can pick some other good things as well. I think Manoj has already joined. Manoj, can you hear us? Hey, Manoj. I think Manoj, you're on mute, I guess.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Good. I've just connected from my mobile hotspot.
No
Hoping
problem.
it's fine.
No
Great.
problem. Yeah, sure. So, Manoj, I think we can quickly pick a couple of questions. Some really good questions are there. Manoj, I think you are on mute again.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
It's
now, yeah.
fine now. Okay, great. Yeah, I was just apologizing. It's just my internet connection gone bad. Hoping it's clear now. We can do
Yeah,
this now.
sure, no problem, Manoj. We understand it's everybody's working home and then, yeah, it happens. So, Manoj, we have a couple of questions. So I have jotted down 7 to 8 questions we have. I think we can spend 10 more minutes to quickly, check these questions. So for the first question is that is GraphQL is better performance than REST APIs? If we talk about automation through REST Assured or Postman, can we reduce the execution time if we compare with REST APIs?
It's really a good question. So as I said, on as I showed you on the tabular, difference between GraphQL versus REST. So in a nutshell, GraphQL as an API way of designing things definitely would show you a different performance improvement, right? Yeah, I think in short, yes, performance will definitely be improved. Instead of you calling multiple endpoints here, you'd be calling one endpoint. And if you Google for GraphQL underfetching and overfetching, there is something called n+1 problem that is something that you will come upon, which is nothing but a problem within GraphQL. But then you can overcome with that using something called data loader. But yeah, I think there is many libraries like GraphQL tracing where you can trace and it will give you how many milliseconds it took to query the data and stuff like that. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Sure. The next question is coming from YouTube actually. So people are asking that, okay, what are the limitations of GraphQL? So according to me, I know that, okay, yeah, GraphQL is no doubt about it, but good. But for non-existing, let's see, if you really want to maintain some HTTP caching system or caching mechanism and monitoring and security and error reporting point of view, I think GraphQL is slightly, I mean, REST APIs are slightly better than GraphQL. So what are your points, your inputs on that?
Can you repeat the last part, Naveen? I missed that.
Yeah, so what I'm asking is that what are limitations of GraphQL as compared to REST APIs?
Okay, all right, got it. So as I said, n+1 is a problem that is something, a problem, I would say. I'm hoping really have an example to show that. Let me quickly take a look at it. Yeah, I'm back on my desktop. Right. So this is what I was talking about, right? So I think answer to previous question. So the moment we do, I'm hoping my screen is visible now. Is that, Naveen?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
All right. So the moment I query movies, name, genre, actor, and age, right? So what happens is even though you have multiple movies name, it will go on loop, right? So if you see, it has around 7 to 8 elements within an array. It'll go up for 8 iterations, right? So which is actually a serious problem within GraphQL. So as you see, movies 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can even see how many milliseconds it took, which is a neat way of looking at it. So which is a major downfall. I think the reason why I wanted to share the screen and show to you is because it answers the first question as well as the second question. I think second question was more around what are the disadvantages. So which is, this is one disadvantage, but there is a way to, this is what we call as an n+1 problem, because it goes on loop on how
Exactly.
many data it has, and it, it takes more time. But as I said, there is something called a concept called data loader, which I haven't implemented in my code base, but on your real life situations, if you have that source of systems, you can use data loader. No matter how many data it has, it will route as a single request and comes back with the response. That will definitely give you a huge performance boost. So in a nutshell, there are different downfalls, but there are also workarounds to overcome with that, like the data loader for this case.
Correct. Okay. So Manoj, we have another question that can you please elaborate more on data types, different types of data in GraphQL?
Sure. So in the schema.js, whatever I have in here, or the different data types that you could use, right? So which is one of the strongest points of schema. As I said, it's a schema definition language where this is the exact type that is going to come back, right? So what are the data types available in GraphQL? There you go. So you have GraphQL string, schema itself, the ID, int, and so on. You can even do something like GraphQL, and then you have float. You can do scalar type, union type, integer, list, non-null. There are different, typically what all you would need it, right? So this is more around, imagine you have a programming language, and you can use that to create a schema, right? So how cool it would be. That is exactly what it is. So in this case, I have my schema written here, but there is also where I can use these data types to create my schema programmatically as well. But I haven't done that, but we can do that as well.
Okay. Yeah, this question actually a lot of people were asking that performance point of view, for a system design point of view. In fact, the same question from my side as well. In GraphQL, what I see, there might be a serious performance issue, especially when we are not maintaining any cache, because in GraphQL you have to create your own HTTP cache. So would it be what's your input on it for performance point of view between GraphQL and REST APIs?
So honestly, I haven't done that study, but I would say I think there's two parts to this question, right? So one, can we really do performance testing, right? Or rather, load testing, right? So how many load, right? So in that case, the one that I can query for this, right? So, or typically this movie ID, right? So what happens if 10 users querying at the same time, how my GraphQL server is performing, right? So which is combination of load and performance. So if you ask that question, as I said, easy GraphQL is also having something called load tester. So easy GraphQL load tester is one tool that you could use in JavaScript if something that you want to do. And Gatling, if you know about that, which is
Mhm.
becoming popular, you can even use Gatling to test GraphQL endpoints. So that will give you understanding. But honestly, I haven't done that study. So I think in the two parts of question, one was what are the tools and can we really do, and I think that is what I answered. On the other question was where do you see the performance. That's where I told I didn't do the study, so
Mhm.
honestly I don't know what is the performance between REST versus API. So if you have that real time, so I think GitHub has its REST API as well as GraphQL. So possibly if you have a free time and if you want to write a blog post open source, so that is one area that you could look at, and I would
Mhm.
be really happy to take a look, and any help that you wanted, I'll be happy to do.
Sure, sure. I think for Gatling we have done some POC, but I'm not sure about, because someone is asking, can we do GraphQL load testing with JMeter? I'm not sure about it. I haven't seen with JMeter any plugin is available or anything is available with JMeter. But yeah, anyways.
There is, I think, in JMeter, I've seen
Mhm.
things that you can do. You can set up a thread group, and you can use some controllers and user flows, on the GUI that you have, and then pass in the query. So it's all about basically. I think in a nutshell, right? So the slides that I showed you. So I think one question that I would want you to ask back, all the users. I know that I can't hear you back, but think answer yourself. So what is the typical difference? This is an example for a GraphQL, right? So you can do the same in REST API. So the only difference is you want to send the GraphQL query in a rest assured understandable format. In this case, here it is what all about, right? So the same way that you would be doing in JMeter as well. So if you test REST API and send in a body parameter of payload JSON payload, you just need to convert that JSON GraphQL query into JSON format, and then do the same procedure you would be doing for REST API. And I think you should be able to achieve that in nutshell.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't see why it will work, but I think it should work.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. So we have one more question that would a GraphQL API design be a good compatible one of relational database structure? Because of the varying request payload, thinking whether standardized indexing on backend relational tables could become a problem. So is it more for NoSQL or non-relational big data stores? I mean, I didn't get the question, but I think he's asking about the same point of view that, okay, we have the relational database structure over there, and then we have NoSQL database. How exactly the GraphQL will be compatible with a NoSQL and SQL databases?
I would say it is doable. I don't see a challenge there because you can define a serverless API with
Mhm.
GraphQL. You can even have MongoDB as I did. Even you can have RDBMS. I don't see a problem, right? So I think in terms of RDBMS, there would be a little bit problems on the actual authorization or fetching the data in a batch, right? So that is something that you could typically do, which would typically fall under the same n+1 problem that I spoke about. But as I said, you can use data loader and stuff like that, and do it.
Okay. And one more question that for authentication and authorization point of view, how exactly, I think it's pretty much clear the way we are using OAuth 2.0 and 1.0 and the basic and primitive authentications in REST APIs that will be done it through OAuth servers. Will it be a separate configuration for OAuth, for GraphQL, just like we have REST APIs, or it's a totally different entity?
You can still, it's a business logic layer, I would say.
Yeah.
I would be happy to show that quickly. So on the GraphQL authentication, right? So the first link that you get is this one, right?
Yep.
So authorization GraphQL. So I would recommend you to take a look at this. As I said, it's a business logic layer, right? So this is how you could do. So I think the GitHub open API that I spoke about is based on authentication, right? So even in Postman, you can even I don't know, I missed the part. Can you help me navigate to the original where we see all the requests? I kind of lost this. Mods.
So have you saved this as a collection?
Yeah, but I'm not able to go back to my previous screen.
Go to your workspace and then,
This is the workspace. Yes, APIs, collections. And then,
yeah, it should be, I think, GraphQL testing, or you need to check what is the collection name.
no, the thing is, it just opens up in my web browser instead. I don't know for some reasons why. I'm not very utilized with Postman. I pretty much do everything on
Mhm.
the,
You was using Postman client or
this is the Postman client, yes.
okay.
So, okay, let's quickly do this, right? So, QL test and save test project. And it still goes there.
You are okay. You are already in your
Yeah, but it just messed up with different.
So just click on this build. I think you are in already browsed. So just click on the build at the bottom. Yeah, just click on it.
There you go. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is what I was going to show earlier. So given the post method, you just need to send in the GraphQL, and then the moment you click on send, it's going to easily bring back the data. And I think Postman recently added, I think version some 7, where until before it was beta stage, and you can use these APIs to upload your GraphQL schema and then get up here. And one of the nicest thing, right? So as I told you in the slides, one thing that I told you is you need to find a way to convert the GraphQL query into a JSON, understandable format. So if you're using Postman to do quick exploratory testing, so one thing that you can do is click on this code. So the moment you click on this code, you have different options, right? So if you click on HTTP, you get this query. So all you have to do is just copy and then paste it in your REST assure. As
Hmm.
simple as that. So I think that is the only caveat that I told about. But once, if you're using Postman and you have access to this code, you can do it. And similarly, I think you have C# REST shop as well, which is the example that I used using the same way. So I think this even in JavaScript XHR, JavaScript fetch. So this is one example that I already showed you using fetch options. So there you go. So even that one caveat, whatever I told, if you're using Postman, you have this code and you can easily copy paste and put it up there. Because I this is not the best way of doing it, but since anyway you'd be doing an exploratory testing before automating, you can use this code and get up there.
Yeah. Yeah, I still remember like 1 year back they started. I mean, more than 1 year back, Postman started supporting GraphQL. That was a great support, and that's one of the best tool available right now for for manual execution point of view for GraphQL. But yeah, that's a great thing. So I think Manoj,
There's one question that I already saw. Is there an online platform for practice where we can practice GraphQL queries?
mhm.
I would say you can clone my repository and then do it if you're happy doing that. I think it should be available as a React GraphQL testing. So
Mhm.
this is the repo. So as you see, it has all the README instructions. So all you need to do is clone this repo, go inside movies, inside server, and all you need to do is npm install and then npm start. And I've used port number localhost 4040, and then you just need to hit this URL on your browser, and then you can practice with the little endpoints that I have here. So I think to start with, you can practice this. Once you're comfortable, you can move to GraphQL, the GitHub's GraphQL, and then practice on complex queries and stuff like that.
Sure. I think one interesting question. I think
Sure.
I never tried, but for monitoring point of view, like we have Kibana and Grafana. Have they started supporting for GraphQL APIs and GraphQL responses?
Yeah, I think we can still do that. I think it's
Mhm.
all for Grafana. All you need is a data source, right? And I think you can easily get from GraphQL. I've seen some dashboards
Yeah,
earlier, but I don't. Nothing strikes off my mind on the fly. But I think Grafana has a way of uploading it. Let me see if I can. Um, so I
Manoj, you
think.
have to share your screen.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So there you go. So it still supports, and you have all the dashboards that you wanted to verify, and has all the up here. So yeah, it's possible. It's doable. And
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. So still, I think we are almost done, guys. If any question someone wants to ask, I think then we are done. Okay. So yeah, Manoj, I think that's the all the questions. Okay, for the different audiences. I have taken a couple of questions from YouTube live chat as well. And thank you so much, Manoj, for giving your time and such a nice presentation, such a nice demos. You have given different examples, okay, from the basics to different examples in REST Shop and curl and Postman, gesture, and everything. So thank you so much for that. We really, really appreciate that. That's a great learning session for all of us. And I would like to special thanks to ThoughtWorks also, who has actually allowed us to, arrange this particular Zoom for the huge crowd that we have right now. So I think that's thank you so much to you and ThoughtWorks as well.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Naveen. I think firstly, as we had a chat, you're already doing a great work of, having nice videos and letting them know Selenium as an open source tool, right? So it wouldn't exist if we are, unless we have community support. I think you're playing a major role in that. So I completely appreciate the efforts that you're doing. And you have a massive, list of people subscribed to your list, and really glad to be on this platform. So thanks for the opportunity. And I hope really it made sense for everyone. I think, as I mentioned, the key takeaway when the connection got cut off was, I think by end of this webinar, you would have, be able to answer what GraphQL is, what are the components, and how do you test for it. At least
Correct.
name some tools. If someone asked you, how do you test for GraphQL? And I think if you can all do that, I'll be, really happy to know that. And any feedback that you have, you can, if you are already connected on LinkedIn, it's open. You can, send in a request. I'll be gladly able to accept it. You can send in feedbacks, and share it on LinkedIn, share it on Twitter, your feedback, and that'll be really helpful.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, I think a lot of people were asking about. In fact, we opened the survey also that are you aware about GraphQL already or not? So hardly 1% people out of 1,300 registrations, they are aware about GraphQL. So I pretty much sure, in fact, after this 1 hour session, people are at least in the situation that where if someone is asking what is GraphQL, definitely we would be able to answer what is GraphQL and how to test it. And this is the way we can start, the learning for GraphQL. So, Manoj, one last thing I would like to request to all the attendees that maybe we can take a snapshot, we can turn on the video, and we can take a good picture that will help, we will share on different platforms if you okay with that. So I'm just going to start my webcam, and then maybe we can take a good picture. I'm not sure, okay, what about others? They can open it or not, and how many I mean, webcams window we can allocate at a time. I'm not sure of. So I would request to all of you that maybe if can someone, you guys can also turn it on, your webcam. Or is it? I think that's a limitation that we cannot do that. Is it? I'm not sure about it. Okay, but it's still, okay. Cool. So that's all, Mukesh. That's all, Manoj, from my side. Thank you so much to all of
Great.
you. Thanks. And we will have more and more sessions like in future. And definitely we would like to see more and more good things, okay, from Manoj.
Would be lovely and glad to do that. All I just need is some feedback, so feel free to do that. We will possibly try to put in some Google form sheet if that's
Yeah.
possible, and also in the meanwhile you can reach out to me individually in LinkedIn or Twitter and then share some feedback. That would be really lovely.
Cool.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Thanks a
so
lot,
much,
folks.
guys. Take
Thanks,
care.
Naveen. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.